is it really worth risking World War III? Is it, should we really protest very hard? And what happens if the Russians just ignore us? What happens if the Chinese just ignore us? And really, so is this really where we want to draw the line? I mean, good Lord, the nervous Nellies and all that sort of thing. And nobody ever flips that on its head. How do I make Vladimir Putin nervous? How do I make Xi Jinping nervous?
From the Defense and Aerospace Report, this is The Downlink, a podcast about the intersection of space, the space business, and defense. Not just what's over the horizon, but what's happening above it. I'm your host, Laura Winter. Let's start with what's visible, the dramas that have unfolded in the last 48 hours. First, iSpace likely lost another lunar lander. The company says its Hakuto R landing craft couldn't read its altitude properly and failed to adequately decelerate and crashed. How badly, why exactly? Unknown, and could take weeks to figure out. This follows iSpace's similar crash in April 2023. That attempt made the company the first commercial enterprise to attempt a moon landing. The bigger story, well, that's the Trump-Musk bromance split up. This involves U.S. President Donald Trump, SpaceX CEO Elon Musk, hundreds of millions in campaign contributions, Doge, NASA, the Pentagon, Next Generation Missile Defense and Golden Dome, and Trump's controversial budget bill. It's all really stinky and complicated. Threats and counter threats are flying, and nobody really knows how this is all going to shake out. That's what's easily seen. This week's episode examines what's not so visible, gray warfare. Last week, Rivada Space Network's CEO Declan Ganley told us about his legal battles with the People's Republic of China. That's nearly $50 million across 150 plus lawsuits and counter lawsuits. That's gray warfare, specifically lawfare. This week, we're examining other types of gray warfare, how to spot it, what it looks like in the space domain. And yes, we're even talking about pirates. I'm joined by Dean Cheng, one of America's most sought-after authorities on China and defense. He's a non-resident fellow at the Potomac Institute and at George Washington University's Space Policy Institute. And also from GW, we have Navy Commander John Patsy Klein, retired aviator, and I just recently read his excellent book, Fight for the Final Frontier, Irregular Warfare in Space. Here's our conversation. Hey, Dean, it's great to have you back on the podcast.
It's great to be back. Thank you for having me again.
And welcome to you, Patsy. This is your first time. It's great to have you here.
Laura, thanks for having me as a guest.
So now, as you guys know, I've just kicked off this small series on gray warfare. And I've spoken a lot with friends and guests, space power advocates, economists, physicists, even a COCOM strategist. And it sparked a lot of, well, how should I say, energetic discussion over rice and curry. Both of your names kept popping up. And my takeaway from that is that while there isn't the clearest of definitions, there is a fuzzy agreement, a general understanding on just what gray warfare is and how it relates to the space domain. It seems only bounded by what constitutes an act of war on one hand and on the other, the limits of our imagination. So this episode is really about doing the audience a solid, right? And giving us, because it includes me and us, a brief 101 on what exactly is gray warfare. So let's start big. What is gray warfare or gray zone warfare? How would we know when we see it, like when we're reading the New York Times? Dean, want to start that one off?
Well, I would say that gray warfare is an outgrowth of our concept that conflict has distinct phases. Phase 0 is peacetime, and then you go through a steady escalation, and each of those stages or phases has some kind of marker for it. And that's all well and good because we are a society that loves to categorize things. The problem is that our adversaries don't live in that same world. And for the Chinese in particular, let's be blunt, they live in the gray. They live in the gray in their society. So this is not just about the warfare. And so rather than having nice, neat, well, we are currently in phase zero. And when we are in phase zero, we have the following authorities and we have the following things that we can and cannot do. And this is law enforcement, and that is a military issue, and that's an intelligence issue. The Chinese, and I suspect the Russians, are much more in the, you know what, we don't like you. And we're not prepared to go to war with you, but we are prepared to subvert your society, hack your power systems, make bad, accusations about how you created COVID or AIDS in Africa, et cetera, and just throw that out to the international community. Now, where this becomes interesting, and the focus for, I think, today's show is now we have this not just in politics and diplomacy, but in space activities.
And Patsy, where are you on this?
So I'm an old naval flyer. We like to keep things simple. But like Dean was saying, in the U.S. and the West, we like to say something is this or that, black or white. Gray zone refers to the shades of gray between black and white. So we're not in peace. We're not in armed conflict. We're somewhere in between. So perhaps 50 shades of gray, if you will. But to Dean's point, U.S. rivals use the gray zone against the U.S. and the West because it works. When we are in armed conflict, we have the Article 5.1 of the United Nations Charter, inherent right of self-defense. So U.S. and the West, if we're attacked in a substantial way, we know what to do. We invoke treaty obligations and we try to go up this escalation ladder. But when it's coercion, compellence, crisis, we have trouble. And to the point, though, gray zone is an old idea. I mean, we've called it different things over the ages. Sometimes we call it irregular warfare. James Cable, who wrote in the Vietnam era, talked about gunboat diplomacy. We had the very short-lived military operations other than war. So it's not just the use of force, but it can be all the instruments of national power. It can be diplomatic, information, economic. It can be tariffs or whatever sanctions that you want. So it's an old idea. We've called it different things. But to your question, what would it be in the New York Times? Perhaps a story on the South China Sea, coercion, some things that are like harassment, but nothing's really happened in a military significant way.
And let me stick with you real quickly there, Patsy. How does gray warfare differ from hybrid warfare? And that's something that I noted in your book. And if you could really briefly give us the title of your book.
Title of the book that you're referring is Fight for the Final Frontier, Irregular Warfare in Space. So thank you for that plug.
Absolutely. My pleasure. It's a great book.
Through Naval Institute Press. They were wonderful for all the authors out there, a great little press. So Dean mentioned the comment, we like to call things this or that. Is it gray zone operations, gray zone warfare, or is it hybrid? So let's just unpack it. We're basically, hybrid is a combination of the high end and the low end. So it could be regular warfare. It could be use of traditional militaries fighting on the field in World War II. It can be that, but it can also be special operations working concurrently. It could be projection of power using naval fleets and the like. So it's this mashup of them both. And what's fascinating, again, back to an old idea, if you look at the historical record and our historical experience, most conflicts are a mashup of hybrid, the high end and the low end. So we can learn from an old book.
Okay, so then what about in the space domain? Space does have particular characteristics as a domain, starting with the very fact that there aren't no guardians aboard armed ships, right? I mean, just to start there. So what characteristics are similar to other military operational domains, and what characteristics are unique to the space domain? In layman's terms, right? Could you give us, like an example or two?
I'm happy to jump on this one, Dean, and hopefully we're in agreement. So, Laura, you bring up this idea of analogy. So, a good friend of mine down in Alabama, Coyote Smith, he'll say, Patsy, all analogies are wrong. Some are useful. So when we do strategic or historical analogies, they're based on a time and a place. So they all break down. But I think we can look to maritime history and our maritime experience for inspiration. But going back to the seminal writings of Karl von Clausewitz in his book On War, he talks about the enduring nature of warfare, but the changing character. So to your point, conflict and competition and crisis in space domain is different than the other domains. But in a strategic sense, I use the maritime domain a lot. We have strategic positions. We have shared lines of communication. We have the interdependence of the other domains. So, my personal view based on my writing over the last couple of decades is we can draw a lot from the maritime domain to glean insights that we would not have otherwise.
It's really interesting that you bring that up because I actually have a note here for follow with Patsy. And I wrote, and I'm now delivering to you, that I noticed in your book that you use a lot of naval concepts, right? And yes, you are from the Navy, so, it's really easy for you to do that. But, right, the Space Force is in the Department of the Air Force, right? So why use naval concepts over air power concepts?
Excellent. And so I'm going to give a quick back brief. When I started 20 years ago, air power theory was the dominant model for thinking about space power theory. And this just owes to the lineage, most of the Air Force officers and the like. Occasionally, someone would bring up Alfred Thayer Mahan and the influence of sea power upon history as inspiration. I am of the ilk of Cyril Julian Corbett, who was a British academic from the early 1900s. So to your question, why use it? Because it's better than air power theory. We have centuries, if not millennia, of experience in the maritime domain. And not to make my air brethren out there bristle, the air power advocates, but air power theory, in my view and my mentor Colin Gray's view, was underdeveloped. For whatever reason, it started off just being a supposition, and then it just never, in my view, fully developed on par with land warfare theory and maritime strategy. So I think we have just better works to draw from. And at the strategic level of war, the similarities are closer in the space domain and the maritime domain.
Yeah. So I think also that there is an interesting other consideration here, which is the issue of how these platforms operate. Air power, and here I'm going to probably anger a whole lot of Air Force people, is in a sense episodic. Bombers show up over the Thanghua Bridge or over Dresden or over wherever, and then they go away. A fighter sweep occurs, and the fighters go away. And for a long time, that was true for satellites, especially in low Earth orbit. But as GEO has become more dominant, as we now deploy mega constellations, we have an issue of persistence. And when we think about Navy operations, an old-fashioned close-in blockade was literally sitting off the mouth of the harbor, right? The fleet in being concept is that there is a fleet out there. And having just visited Norway recently, the Tirpitz is a wonderful example of a fleet in being where a single battleship just consumed massive amounts of resources. So what we have here is, I think, an interesting question of then when we are thinking about the strategic impact, air power brings enormous firepower to a particular battle. Now, eventually you achieve air dominance, air supremacy, and you rule the skies. But to get there, you have this. Whereas maritime is, as I said, persistent. And I think space is evolving in the direction of that persistence. And what does that imply then from the strategic level? And again, I think Patsy's, not just this book, but his other volumes as well, really does a great job of exploring these elements. And by highlighting the maritime parallel, brings a lot of this to the forefront.
So going back, like I was explaining, like 20 years ago, air power theory was in vogue. But if you listen to General Saltzman, the chief of space operations, what you'll see in his public statements is he wants to go from a merchant marine to a Navy. So this maritime analogy has taken hold of the Space Force. And go back to what Dean was mentioning about the comparisons to air power theory. For a lot of folks, they took air superiority and they turned it into space superiority. But that was really kind of disingenuous because you never achieved superiority. It was based on an area of operations and it was for a specific period of time. And so that kind of broke down. But if you look, the Space Force published this wonderful document, and I'll tell all your listeners, you can get it online. It's unclassified. It has to do with space warfighting. And it uses the maritime framework of space superiority having spatial, this is and temporal, so time and place. So superiority is based on time and place, like the maritime domain. The maritime domain was so huge, you could never have superiority at all places at all time. So it was picking those locations most important. The Space Force is fully on board with that thinking, which has been a long time coming.
So look, guys, in last week's episode, Dean and I, we talked a lot about lawfare, right? And I hope that the audience is familiar with radio signals jamming and spoofing and cyber operations. These have been subjects on this podcast on many occasions. So what I'd really like, though, for you guys to do, and I've got a little bit of a checklist here as well to make sure that we get them all, because some of these things aren't up in orbit, right? But what are the different types of gray warfare that, have a space play? Dean, you've written tons on lawfare. We spoke a ton about it last week. What would be the next one on your list?
Well, actually, I would say that there's an almost infinite variety of gray zone activities. So, for example, some of the things that you've already mentioned, you have jamming, right? Now, a few years ago, not that long ago, almost nobody jammed satellite communications and things. The Iranians did it several times. They got very heavily criticized. But major powers, Russia, China, the United States, nobody did this. I think it's been since the Ukraine war that we have now seen just open season on a variety of systems, everything from GPS to communications in terms of jamming. So that heads very close to military activity, and it is occurring particularly around Ukraine in the context of war. But we have other things. For example, sitting on frequencies as people try to, compete for spectrum and bandwidth. Now, is that gray zone warfare, or is that just smart competition? When you're talking about the Chinese who have state-owned enterprises, that line gets even fuzzier. And then you have things like accessing different countries to build out infrastructure. China building radio telescopes in Argentina. Argentina, notably, is in the southern hemisphere. That's actually very important for a lot of space operations. If you want to track satellites where if somebody wants to move them, they might do it when it's on the other side of the planet. Again, is that gray zone warfare, or is that just the Chinese Academy of Sciences wanting to extend its relations? And that's the point, right? Gray zone warfare is almost by definition, is it warfare at all? Or can I bin it into some other folder, category, and file cabinet drawer?
So, Dean has written a wonderful pieces over the years, which I use in my writings a lot. So, Laura, you asked for a checklist. So let's just list out some stuff. Jamming of communication signals, using lasers, shooting lasers at electro-optic stuff, especially if they're reversible. If I don't cause permanent damage, was that a use of force, an armed attack, or just a nuisance? Was that just some teenagers just doing things that they shouldn't? How about distorting norms? So, again, it has to do with this long-term competition. But as we go to the moon and look for lunar resources, maybe there's competition over water ice and how close can we get to each other, and declaring excessive safety zones there. Cyber attacks. We saw this leading up into the Russia's invasion in Ukraine, where, before the Russians invaded, we had cyber attacks against a U.S. commercial company, Viasat. And let's bring up commercial some more. The role of proxies and proxy war. I'm not using my military, but I'm going to go ahead and use my commercial vendors, or even more problematic for the U.S., how about a third-party commercial that's not between the rivals? What if India provides commercial that the PRC or Russia uses? Is the U.S. going to go after India's commercial? They may have pause. So we could go on and on, but there's a long list of items.
Oh no, do go on because listen, I saw in your book you've got a whole section on piracy and privateers. That's also a possibility, right? And just because you can't, well, maybe you can take some things up in space, but that's not to say you can't take over ground installations as well as with a private military company, right? I mean, there's all kinds of ways of going after this. No.
There is. And so you mentioned pirates. Before the book started, I said, I want a section on space pirates. I was thinking about
Arr.
the movie The Martian, and I just wanted to have it. But there's a legal base. It has to do with, are you acting inside the law or outside the law? And that depends on perspective. If you even look at our revolutionary. But to your point, we call them private military companies. It is big business, as we know from Iraq and Afghanistan. We don't like to talk about it in the US and the West. But historically, private military companies, Sean McFate, who's a professor over at Georgetown, we'll call them mercenaries. Let's just be clear what we're talking about. They provide training and education, logistical services, or security. And that's what gets all the notoriety in the New York Times or the papers. In the space domain, we're seeing logistical services now. We're seeing commercial vendors or contractors providing refueling operations for satellites in the geostationary belt, which is a very important orbit above Earth. So we're starting to see the inklings. Who am I acting on whose behalf? And then we have President Putin's declaration that SpaceX's Starlink was acting on behalf of the U.S. and Ukraine. So was Starlink a proxy for military operations? So we're having these blurred lines. The West and the U.S. may say one thing, but our rivals may come to a different conclusion.
You're going to get to a point that I want to make a little bit later on trying to figure out that sort of fuzzy zone in the commercial sphere. So just hang on to those thoughts for a quick second. But another thing that I thought was really interesting and is not really well talked about is financial warfare. We don't really talk about this, but it's a real thing. I mean, tariffs and stuff like that aside, and the fact that China's been hanging on to magnets, which are really critical to space systems. I mean, there are other forms of financial warfare, like investments and taking over boards and stuff like that. I mean, how much are you tracking on that?
So finance and things, it's not just literal money and investments, but also it's intellectual property. If I am a venture capitalist and I want to fund Patsy Corp's new satellite concept or new operating concept, I have a right, before I invest dollars, euros, yen, renminbi, Dr. Klein, can I see your business plan? Dr. Klein, can I see the technical specifications? Now, if I'm an above board venture capitalist, that's simply part of the process. And that's true whether Patsy's making potato chips, computer chips, or satellites. But what if I'm unscrupulous? What if I have part of my VC grouping is perhaps entities who are in it more for intelligence gathering? Let me flip that to the other end. Imagine a company, Smith Corp, has gone out of business. When it is liquidated, its intellectual property is up for grabs. Taking a non-space example, I think it's 23andMe, the ancestry, the genetic
Testing company. Yep.
has gone out of business. What happens to whoever takes over and buys up all of its assets? Does it get access to all of that genetic information and material? So if we transfer that to a space concept, what if an operator of a small constellation of synthetic aperture radar satellites or Earth imaging satellites or communication satellites goes out of business? What happens to its asset? I mean, this is a very well-established part of bankruptcy law. That's not the question. The question is who's bidding. The question is who's supporting the various bidders, and what happens to the information that normally would be confidential, whether it's the contracts or the designs of the satellites or any of a myriad array of these things. It's finance. It's well established. It's not open to question. but who is in the background? Who is benefiting? Cui bono? Those questions remain applicable.
Okay, then. So then I got to ask you guys, which one of the gray warfare types, and I really don't have a good term for that except for calling it types, right? But which one of these types actually concerns you the most and why? And I'm asking you this because people really love to focus on the sexy, right? Like national security space launch, which is cool. Rocket launches are cool. But I feel, and which means, hey, feelings are not statistically sound, but my gut is telling me it's likely that it is the least sexy of all of these things that is actually our vulnerable soft underbelly, like financing or regulation or maybe not. Maybe I'm wrong.
So, to me, our Achilles heel, where Americans usually have trouble, is when our rivals use time as a weapon. So this has to do with what's called in strategy the cumulative strategy. So these insignificant little actions, which is not use of force or armed attack, it's just little things, little coercion in the South China Sea, whatever like that. Maybe establishing a norm or two. Maybe it's international standards, whatever it is, and it's just over time they pile up. And if you do nothing,
Buying a number of shares in a company, just keep buying them in, 2% increments.
yeah, or getting members of the board, which Dean mentioned too. So over time, you're like, well, that's a pain, but it's nothing that I'm going to really mess with. Over the term, a time of decades, it can have strategic effect. And by the time that you realize you should have done something, it's too late, and you realize I should have acted 10 years ago. So as for the space domain, going to the moon, establishing norms on proximity, what is safe and responsible behavior, are these constant jamming and lasing events that going on that we do maybe nothing about, or are we just saying this is just part of it? Cyber attacks, the same thing. So if we do nothing, if there's no consequence, are we helping establish a norm that our rivals can get to? But so it's the time as a weapon. And I know you talked about lawfare in your previous episode. The problem is if you can't just sit back and do nothing. And that's in the West, we have trouble with that because we don't see it rising to the threshold to warrant a substantial response. So how do you take defensive or offensive actions to take this freedom of action away from your rivals in these time as a weapon, in these lawfare type of environments? There's folks who've written about it. I've written a little bit. Charlie Dunlap, who coined the term lawfare, and some of his folks who follow it have looked at that too. But we can't sit back and do nothing. You will lose.
So I was going to start by saying I think one of the greatest problems we have is being self-deterred. That we tend not to respond to the jamming, the lasing, the this, that, and the other because, well, is it really worth risking World War III? Is it, should we really protest very hard? And what happens if the Russians just ignore us? What happens if the Chinese just ignore us? And really, so is this really where we want to draw the line? I mean, good Lord, the nervous Nellies and all that sort of thing. And nobody ever flips that on its head. How do I make Vladimir Putin nervous? How do I make Xi Jinping nervous? Somebody tells me that, the Ukrainian drone strike that hit across Russia, if that had been proposed to an American audience, the issue wasn't could we do it. I have few doubts that we probably have better technology. It would be all the various folks are, but really, isn't that escalating? Isn't, I suspect Mr. Putin right now is much more worried about what Zelensky is going to do than what the entire combined armed might of the United States could do. But then I realized that, actually that's not the issue. The real issue is our fundamental starting assumptions. We have so many assumptions that we don't question anymore. And frankly, that's our fault. It is the fault of the foreign policy establishment and the policymaking community not explaining to the American public why alliances matter, why space matters. We just sort of talk among ourselves. Well, it's obvious. And if anyone's questioning that, well, they're just a bunch of rubes. So, for example, we assume that the United States physically is off limits. In any conflict, nobody's going to go after Vandenberg. Nobody's going to go after Canaveral. Nobody's going to go after Grand Forks. We assume that we will be the ones who set the industrial standards and the political norms that Patsy was just talking about. We assume all of these things. And yeah, okay, time to make a confession on the record here. I'm an old Star Trek fan. And
so am I.
Yeah. Commander Montgomery Scott, Lieutenant Commander Montgomery Scott's one of his favorite lines was, "Captain, I cannot change the laws of physics." Unfortunately, we have made so many of these assumptions into laws of physics. We assume that no one will come after CONUS facilities. That's not a law of physics, however. That is a hope. That's a belief. But Commander Scott could probably twist that one pretty darn well and still keep the Enterprise flying. And that's sort of, to me, that is really what is going to kill us. I don't disagree with anything Patsy said, but I think that it's all rooted in this much deeper, it's not just about space. What is a fact? What is a law? And what is an assumption? And if we don't stop conflating those three, we could find ourselves in a very, very bad place.
I think it's really interesting that you bring that up in a certain way. And maybe I'm making the wrong connection here, and forgive me if I am. But something that has really bothered me about the beginning of the description of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Everyone does rightly point out that it started with a cyber attack, 12 hours or so before the first tanks rolled across. And in fact, it wasn't a single cyber attack. It was a number of cyber attacks. And I've done a series on that. But what everyone seems to forget or conveniently push to the side is that cyber attack didn't occur on Ukrainian systems. That cyber attack was on U.S.-owned systems, and that company's name is Viasat. Its headquarters is located in Carlsbad, California. And we conveniently seem to forget that that was an attack on a U.S.-owned space system. That is also used by military forces of all stripes and nations that are allied around the world as well. It might not be Vandenberg, but it is a space system that is used by our military, our allies. And yet, I don't know, we just don't talk about it. Isn't that weird?
It's weird. We talk about the national security community, but, it's like, hey, but again, it has to do with this, like, nobody died, right? At least not directly on that we can point to in the news, but a cyber attack is reversible. It's non-kinetic. It's in the threshold of how we do military escalation.
It wasn't actually that reversible because, if they could have reversed it if they got every single one of those routers back, but actually Viasat, because they wanted to serve their customers, actually ended up sending out all these new routers to get everybody back up online. So, well, I guess you could say less people would be affected, and therefore, hopefully less people, if they were affected on a life or death sort of situation, wouldn't be in that situation, so to speak. Right? So it wasn't actually all that reversible, quite frankly. Okay. They suffered a real financial setback because of that. Unless, of course, unless Russia wants to write them a check, right?
So, the question for the U.S. is it a crime? So do we put this into the court system, or does it warrant a military response? So that's sometimes we have trouble with understanding. Okay, we don't want to escalate with Russia, like Dean was saying, but to Dean's bigger point, and again, sometimes I think in the U.S. we're kind of lazy. We like the mirror image, thinking that everyone has the same worldview that we do. But, China, Russia, and the U.S., very different, but based on societal, cultural, historical different worldviews in the deterrence ladder and what is acceptable cost. So, again, it's hard we like to take our Western values of what is acceptable and right and project it on our rivals.
So think of this, right? We've been talking a lot about what other nations have been doing to us or to our allies, to their commercial partners, to our commercial partners, et cetera, et cetera. But I've got to wonder, we, the U.S., we've got to be engaging in gray zone warfare too, right? Perhaps this is a great place to actually tackle commercial space organizations, like I said, we were going to do. And just, what that means in the West and what that actually means in the East. And that's because there's no real agreed definition by these two very distinct cultures, perhaps that, how should I say, excuse me, three, two, one. And perhaps that ambiguity actually works in some cases for the United States and for the West, and in some cases against our interests, right? I mean, when a Chinese company starts something, an investment, we all act surprised that it's space, somehow state sponsored activity that supports the Chinese Communist Party's goals. But when a US company does something that fits with a US strategic goal, the US can always claim that, hey, this was the act of a purely commercial player, right? And because of that, the US bears very little responsibility for whatever that was, right? At least in Western public opinion. And Dean, I really was listening to you last week, I promise, because you said public opinion is a major, major thing to reaching your political goals, right? So in the West, that kind of gives us a little bit of wiggle room to do some things, maybe even enough wiggle room for those pirates.
If I had to pick one point that, to your question, is the U.S. involved in gray zone operations? It's the use of commercial. So we looked for it for innovation, for strategic advantage, but using it as a proxy war in our conflicts across the world, it does give us some leverage. And, the policy world, we say there's power in ambiguity. So we can use the commercial operators, doing military-like things, being involved in the kill chain, but say, hey, that's commercial. That's just free trade and economics.
Oh, here's another great one, I think. And I think, Dean, you very specifically will really appreciate this one, right? There's, the Earth observation company, Planet Labs, right? And essentially, they recently decloaked what were to be ambiguous activities as such. And what they were able to unveil was a severely damaged North Korean, I'm going to say this wrong, Chohaeon class destroyer. It seems like something went wrong when when they tried to launch the ship, and now it's covered by a blue tarpaulin. But commercial satellite imagery shows that this ship, next to a boat launch facility, is partially submerged. That's a public perception and a political loss for North Korea and a real win for the West. But those images were made available by Planet Labs. It's no spy satellite. There's no classification to have to go through. And yet there was a big win. How does that all sort of fit in?
Well, I mean, yes. The more authoritarian the society, the more they desperately want to control information. We have the Great Firewall of China as perhaps one of the best examples of how much. That being said, remember, this cuts all ways, and it's not just red versus blue. So a commercial satellite imaging company not based anywhere in a NATO country and not based in Russia or China or North Korea or Iran could easily take pictures of the amphibious facilities around Little Creek and say, you know what? There's a whole lot of missing U.S. amphibious ships. It may even find them, say, off of Incheon or somewhere in the Baltic. That company could easily, in the interest of the people's right to know, broadcast that. Now, which is worse? The Americans or the Russians being the victim of that kind of information? And the answer, I think, depends very much on the conflict. I think that for those pilots and airmen in particular who were ready to go in 1990 during the Gulf War, before we started that, imagine if somebody had said, hey, there's all these airplanes sitting on the tarmac lined up ready to go, and they sure look like they're weaponeered. That could have cost lives. So free flow of information is something that Western open societies can handle better because our general nature is more open. But that doesn't mean that fundamentals of military security, which are true no matter what kind of society you serve, aren't jeopardized by this massive explosion in accessible information. So I hesitate in trying to sort of say, well, we're better off or we're worse off. I think all of us are operating in this radically different environment.
So who's winning at this? And why are they winning at this?
I'm going to say China is winning in the gray zone because U.S. and the West, we have trouble with the response. We're reluctant for all the reasons that we've been laying out. It's hard for us to get our heads around. We need to do something and act, and even fear this escalation where we talk about international relations theory, which is a big sleeper of a thing, but this idea of the security dilemma, I need to self-restrain so I don't cause my rivals to think that I'm looking to attack them or escalate world crisis. So that's what I say. But I say that they're winning, but what are the strategic advantages of the U.S. and the West? It's our commercial. I will still say, at least for now, our commercial is better than our rivals' commercial and our allies and partners, even though we make it such a pain for U.S. allies to get along. We have more friends on any given day, mostly, than I would say Russia and China. I would say sometimes those friends of theirs are coerced for other reasons. So I think we can get there. We have some things to look forward to, but when it comes to gray zone, I think our rivals do it better consistently.
And Dean, winning or losing?
So I agree with Patsy that I think the Chinese, I'm not so sure about the Russians, but I think the Chinese are doing very well. I think that to his two solutions, I think that I'd actually give more emphasis to the commercial. Not because not only is our commercial probably better than their commercial, and it's fascinating, for example, that a Chinese company is now testing a stainless steel rocket that's going to land, between two prongs. Where have I seen that before? But I think that a lot of our commercial stuff is better than their military stuff, than their even some of their classified stuff. And that, whether that's true or not, that is their fear. It is not an accident that the Chinese opened up their aerospace sector to truly private commercial ventures only after Mr. Musk and Mr. Bezos and others opened up the possibility of all of these entrepreneurs saying, you know what, there are bucks to be made. I'm going to invest in that and I'm going to reap those bucks because you know what? Gordon Gekko was right. Greed is good. It drives companies, it drives people to innovate, to find more efficient methods. Now, all that being said, the funny thing about allies and things, and this is where I am going to slightly disagree with my friend Patsy, from the Chinese perspective, I want to emphasize that, it's from the Chinese perspective, they have gotten along throughout most of their history without allies. Chinese theories of international relations, particularly during the Warring States period, had horizontal versus vertical alliances, but it was by no means clear that having allies was necessarily stronger, and in fact, in some cases, created vulnerabilities. So having allies can be good, but we need to recognize that that's from our perspective and our history and, Treaty of Westphalia onwards. I don't think the Chinese see a whole lot of flags on the other side of the conference table and say, oh my gosh, I'm losing. Would they like some more flags? Sure, if it doesn't cost them anything. But above all, and this is a very interesting, different strategic issue, but probably has some applications to space. When it comes to alliances, in a sense, it's fighting not to lose. I don't care if I have allies. I just want to make sure country X doesn't join you. That's a very different strategy, a very different incentive structure. Now, is that going to be true so long as China is trying to establish space infrastructure in third-party countries? That may change. But for the moment, at least, I think that they are looking at this in the space context as, yes, you have lots and lots of countries signing up for Artemis. What happens if some of those countries leave and join me? Right now, you have more. You take that as a strength. If any of those countries leave because I got to the moon first, what is the impact then of having now fewer allies? What is the impact then of those countries deserting you and joining me?
That's a really great segue into the final question, guys, and it's crystal ball time. As someone smart said, what we do here on Earth will extend into the heavens. And I don't really know who originally said that particular thought, and it's not a quote, but I know somebody did say it. But what would gray warfare look like on the moon or Mars?
What I wrote in the book, I use the South China Sea as my analogy a lot. So you have the PLA maritime forces acting, it's not It's not a navy, it's something else, but it's coercion against the Filipino fishermen in the Scarborough Shoal and surrounding areas. It's close proximity, getting their ships really close to get coercive effects and get people to back down. And again, using proximity. So this would extend to the moon. When we go to the lunar South Pole, how close can we have the bases between the two countries? And what's the role of commercial? Will the PRC use their version of commercial like they do their maritime forces, their militia forces in that coercive effect? So for me, that's an easy extrapolation.
I hate you, Patsy, for taking the
you told me everything
the
I know.
good example there. So I'm going to.
Well, he took the moon, but the Mars is still up for discussion.
The second or maybe third best answer, and I would say so. I'm going to throw two out there. One is PNT networks. Who puts out position, navigation, timing networks, whether around the moon or around Mars, first? And if they follow the U.S. strategy of GPS, it's really hard to compete against a free service. So if the Chinese put up PNT, whether on the moon or around Mars, and there's no commercial case to be made for that. That's one of the problems about relying on commercials sometimes is, tell me what my shareholders are going to say. That could easily create a situation where others, maybe not the United States, but a whole lot of other countries, are simply dependent on China for a fundamental key infrastructure. And, there are very few prizes for coming in second.
And just for the audience, explain PNT and why it would be critical around the moon.
Position, navigation, timing, PNT, GPS is PNT, Beidou is PNT, Galileo is PNT, GLONASS is PNT. It basically tells you how to get from here to Sheboygan in your family car. Or in this case, perhaps to Shackleton Crater or one of the other craters. Where are you going to land? How close can you risk landing, especially because you will be kicking up lots of lunar dust, and lunar dust has somewhat different properties from Terran dust. Gets into lots of places, etc. So you probably actually want to be very careful about where that dust plume might go. So, Mars, even more problematic potentially. We know we know more about Mars today than we did 20 years ago, but still, where are you going to land? How are you going to coordinate? Where is Matt Damon? Darn it! And how is he going to get to that return vehicle? The other thing I'm going to throw out there is when we talk about piracy, we tend to think about eye patches, parrots, peg legs, Vasi scurvy swabs. But the reality is that most spacecraft, especially in lunar traffic, are probably going to be unmanned. So really, your pirate is much more likely to be botnets. And that's an interesting question about what will that look like, especially if what is it? I think it's a 3-second delay to get comms from the moon, and it's a 7-minute delay, the 7 minutes of terror out on Mars. So a lot more autonomy, a lot more artificial intelligence, not necessarily Cyberdyne Systems Model 101, but that also creates some interesting questions about hacking, some interesting questions about botnets, some interesting questions about denial of service when you are 7 minutes away. And by the way, the Chinese have just started deploying an orbiting supercomputer constellation. What is the point of this? Processing the data in space rather than beaming it down to Earth. You get that right in Earth's orbit, you may want to replicate that, say, for Mars. Again, saves you a lot of time. You probably don't want to send it to a data center on Earth. You don't even want to send it to a data center, at Utopia Planitia. So that really creates some interesting questions about what is, I think Patsy would agree, is very emblematic gray zone activities, hacking, cyber, etc., but in a truly extraterrestrial sense.
Dean, Patsy, thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Laura, for having me. Thanks.
That's it for this week. For your daily dose of award-winning defense coverage, listen to the Defense and Aerospace Report with Vago Muradian. And for the maritime domain, listen to Cavas Ships with Chris Cavas and Chris Cervello, and get your air domain news and analysis from the Air Power Podcast with JJ Gertler and Vago Muradian. I'm Laura Winter. Thank you for listening.